Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all very much. I just appreciate this opportunity to share our budget work that we've been taking on over the last 4 months. Obviously, the work with the budget has been compounded by the pandemic. And so as we created this budget, we really worked collaboratively and tried to be as creative as we possibly could to manage the fiscal responsibility that we have, but also manage the needs of our students, which could be ever-changing as a result of the time that we've had this year. So where are we now? Our current enrollment is 2,176 students, and our total budget is $32,315,730. So how do we build a budget? What are the steps that we take? So every year we start with 0 and build the budget based on student needs. So we don't just take the teachers and pull everybody forward. We start with our student class sizes policy and our number of students that we have actually as we predict enrollment for the next year. So we call this our zero-based budgeting approach. What does that look like? So if we look at this graph, the red is our projected enrollment from last year. So you can see approximately at Marshall High School we were slightly over 700, it was about 730 projected enrollment for last year. The yellow is our projected enrollment for next year. And so if you look at the dots represent our staffing levels. And so if you look at Marshall High School, you can see that there's a slight decrease in enrollment at Marshall High School projected for next year. And as a result, we're going to have a reduction in 1 staff person. So when we looked at our numbers, we felt like we could reduce our staffing at Marshall High School by 1 science teacher. There's a retirement, and that's why we took that position and chose not to fill it. If you look at Marshall Middle School, the enrollment's relatively the same, but we did look at the French position. There's a half-time French position, and we felt like we could reach the needs of students through an online program for that French 1 class in 8th grade, and we took the opportunity to take that half-time savings there. So students don't really get adversely affected by that, but we were able to take a savings. At the Great Work School, you can see the enrollment's basically the same and the staffing levels are going to be the same. Elliott Elementary School, you can see a slight drop in enrollment, or a significant drop in enrollment at Elliott Elementary School, and we took a full classroom teacher there as well. A little bit of a red flag, just to be mindful of. The pandemic has made projecting enrollment a little trickier. And so there are families that may have kept children home and not sent them to pre-K or K, and just said we're just going to keep kids home. So we're not really sure what those numbers are, so we projected our enrollments. We feel comfortable taking the position at Elliott Elementary School, but there is some variables that are a little bit different this year than in traditional years. So summary of our board class size policy, and I know we talked about this in the fall, but it's always good to kind of come back to this. And so pre-K is really a state requirement that you can have up to 16 students, but if you're going to have 16 students, it needs to be a teacher and an ed tech to get to that number. So that's really a state requirement. The tricky part with that would be if you have 9 students, you would still need a teacher and an ed tech. So if you get over that number of 8, you can have a teacher with 8 or less. As soon as you break that number of 8, you need to have the ed tech with that. Kindergarten to grade 1, we have a range of 14 to 18 students. Grade 2 to grade 5, we have 18 to 22 students. Grade 6 to grade 8, we have 18 to 25 students. And then grade 9 to grade 12, we have 15 to 25 students. Just to remember with our class size policy, by policy we can be 1 below or 1 above that policy. So for instance, at Marshall Middle School, we can have a class size of 26 and manage it internally. If we were to ever go 2 above or 2 below, we would have to come to the board to get board approval to do that. So just a reminder for that policy. So how do we come up with schools' individual service and supply accounts in their budgets? So what we do is we come up with a dollar amount. And so the current dollar amount for this year is at $230 per student at the elementary schools. There's $235 per student at the middle school, and $280 per student at the high school. Those numbers, these are adjusted numbers, and I'll go into a little bit more. The bottom part is a change, and so when we looked at our budgets over the last 3 years, there was a substantial amount of supply money left at the high school, and so we felt like that they were being over supplied. And so one of the things that we looked at is that in the past, for vocational students, we were giving them credit for full students even though those students are at the school only half-time. So one of the ways that we were able to look at money is that we adjusted the amount of cost per student that we would give for vocational students. So, at Elliott Elementary School, there's a projection of 296 students for next year. You multiply that by the 230, and you come up with the $68,080. That would give you your supply account. So that's where that number is generated from. That $230 amount is an increase from last year. And so we increased $10 per student at the elementary and $5 per student at the middle school. And we reduced at the high school for $20 per student. And then we also made a differentiator around vocational. Why did we do that? One of the things that really has hit us as we've navigated this pandemic is the reliance on technology. And having programs and the licensing fees for those programs is expensive for some of the things that we're doing. And we feel like we're going to need going forward as we remediate students. And so we had to create some more money in the budget to be able to offset the cost of those things. Cost drivers. So next year, we're anticipating about a $342,000 increase for district salaries for all bargaining units. Health insurance, every year we plan for a 10% increase in health insurance costs, which costs us about $450,000. And that's the number that the MEA Benefits Trust recommends that we plan for every year. That's not just a number that we kind of picked out of a hat. That was what the recommendation is. We lost about $153,000 in state subsidy. And then there's some district goals that we really felt were important that we needed to invest some more money in. One of those things would be our continued DEI work that we've started. So district goals.
John, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the slide that you just had with the salaries and all that?
Yeah.
One more.
Yep.
342,000 for 400 districts. That doesn't look right. What am I missing? I'm confused.
Is that including administration as well?
That's everything. That's bus drivers. There's about 400 different.
But it's only 342,000?
That's just the increase.
That's the increase.
Oh, I'm
that's
sorry.
The increase.
All right, that's what I'm missing. Thank
Yep.
you.
Nope.
Got it. Like,
No.
what is happening right now?
That would make
Thank
this
you.
conversation a lot easier,
Right?
right?
Wouldn't that be wonderful? Like, what,
Yeah,
I'm
that's just the
missing
increase.
something really
Yeah.
big. Thank you.
Yeah.
Increase. I
Yeah.
didn't read the title.
So-
There we go.
The $342,000 is an increase.
Got it.
The $450,000 is an increase. The loss in state subsidy is a decrease in funding, and then the $45,000 is an increase.
Got it. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Sorry I wasn't more clear.
No, that's my fault.
District goals. District goals are based on our strategic plan. Students are the reason for our work. Their voice, input, and active engagement is vital to our continued improvement. Their success is how we measure our success. And so, again, that strategic plan helps guide us as we start to have these tough conversations about how do we allocate funds, how do we allocate time, how do we allocate staffing. So our visualization of our strategic plan, students, as you can see, are in the middle. There's the circle in purple. They're supported by the community and by the staff. There's also 6 domains: safety, excellence in learning, positive relationships, character, student voice, and equity and support. And then there's the resources that we use, which is human resources, time resources, and fiscal resources. And that really constitutes the work that we do. So number one, the first domain is excellence in learning. So my recommendations. That we would add 3 study hall monitors at Marshwood High School to maximize teacher contact time with students. And so as we bring a lot of students back, we're not sure where they're going to be. And so rather than having staff perform duties throughout the course of a day, such as being in study hall, being in lunch duty, we felt like for a much more reasonable cost, we could have other people come in and do that and free up our teachers to be able to work directly with students. That's about a $36,000 cost, for about $12,000 each for each one of the monitors. Half-time speech and language teacher, and so this really, it will appear as an ad, but what we're really doing is we spend a lot of money in our contracted services for speech and language professionals, and so rather than doing contracted services, we're going to hire our own person and have a little bit more control, and that allows us to save some money on top of that. So although it will look like a new position, we're moving some money around to be able to pay for it. But that's about a $42,500 cost. how do we prioritize? So if we're going to spend, we've got to be able to balance off how we're going to pay for these things, because obviously we're trying to be as fiscally conscious as we can be. So there's some position cuts. We mentioned the position cut at Marshwood High School, which would be one science position. There is the half-time French position at Marshwood Middle School, and then there'll be a teaching position at Elliott Elementary School. And that is all based on student enrollment. Again, zero-based budgeting approach. That saves about $195,000. Again, I talked a little bit about restructuring the educational supplies at all the schools. That saved us about $26,000. So remember, the elementary schools, cost per student went up. The number of students stayed the same, slightly dropped some other places. And then really the savings really came from the high school, really looking at how we're allocating the high school supplies. And again, so I think we all get nervous about supplies at times. But the model that we have had was really based on 10 years ago, where textbooks was really the cost driver for supplies. And I remember when I was principal of the middle school, textbooks, they were expensive as it was, but then shipping was like 18%. So if you spent $10,000 on new textbooks, you were spending almost another $2,000 on shipping. And so the reliance on that is a little bit less than what it used to be. And so that's why we're kind of trying to reallocate that money a little bit. And again, we're basing that on actually what has been spent. So it's not just saying, hey, look, we need to cut this money. We're looking back and saying, hey, what money is being used at the end of the year? If there's money left over, let's really look at what we're doing. Again, excellence in learning, superintendent's recommendation. I shared with you that we had a relationship with RSU30, where we shared 2 of our employees with them, and we created some revenue for us, and then they shared 2 of their employees with us, and we had to pay for that service. And so those positions were a technology director, which is on your agenda for this evening, and then the other part was an integration and support person at the middle school became an issue for us. And so currently, we have one person, and let me just back up for 1 second, I'm sorry. One of the things that amongst the pandemic that really, I think, struck all of us was that from a technology infrastructure of support, we're not in really great shape. We have the stuff, we have one-to-one laptops, we have the ability to do things, but we don't have the support to help students, staff, and support those devices if there's breakage. And so right now, at our elementary school, we have one person that travels from Elliott Elementary School to Central to the Great Works School. And obviously we try to keep him in one building a day to minimize the travel. But if you can imagine being at the Great Works School and then having to travel to Elliott and back over the course of an 8-hour workday, that's 40 minutes in a car. And just years ago when we didn't have one-to-one, when we only had 4 cows at the Great Works School, with 20 computers on it, we would just push the cow around. That was different to now, where every student is one-to-one with either a Chromebook or an iPad. So that the stress on our technology department has grown incrementally. So part of this position would be a integration person, support person at Marshall Great Works School. So half the time they would support the technological needs at the Great Works School, and then they would work district-wide around how to integrate technology. That's one of the areas that we have done a really great job on over the years. The cost, that's about $75,000. We talked about this a little bit earlier in the year. So we purchased an incredible amount of technology this year using federal funds. And so we've been able to save some money from the budget by doing that, which is a great thing. So we saved about $50,000 from a technological lease program. So typically we have a 3-year lease for $50,000 every year, so we can continue to buy technological equipment. And so because we bought so much this year, we can forego the lease for next year. Great news. Here's the trouble with that, is that 3 years from now, we're going to have to put that money back, or we're going to get out of sync with our purchasing plan. And so there's a lot of things that we try to maximize the monies that we spent this year, but I just want to give a word of caution that we just need to be mindful that a lot of these things are going to create relief for a year or two, but we need to keep it on our radar that this money is going to have to go back in eventually. Or a different plan is going to have to come up eventually. Positive relationships. Superintendent's recommendation. We talked about this as you talked about it as a board and shared your thoughts with me. And so I have a pool of points where I can kind of, my new opportunity points, where if I see a need in the district, I can allocate those points. And one of the areas that I'd like to do that is to kind of create these parent-student community communication positions in each one of the buildings to be able to share what's happening in the buildings. We used the term, when we posted the position for this year, using some ESSER money, as good news ambassadors was the term that I had used. So you may have seen an email for those. But we're asking to put those in the budget permanently. Again, I kind of go back to, I know I shared the example with you that, a bulletin board solves all the problems until you don't keep up the bulletin board. And so if we're gonna truly communicate using technology, we've got to stay on top of that. And we've got to get rid of old information, we've got to update new information. We can provide a resource, because it only takes once or twice for a family to go to a place, not get what they're looking for, to give up on it. That's about a $5,000 cost for that. Aptigee, the program that we're in the process of working on, and it has really been great, but we're having some time to really go through our website right now. The cost for that's about $8,000. So that will be an increase in the budget for next year. We're going to remove the Blackboard Connect program. We've had some issues with that over the last 6 months, as I shared with you 2 days ago, or yesterday. That seemed like a long time ago, but it was yesterday. And so that saves us about $4,000. So we're going to add some money, but we're going to also take some money away. And I know this is a tremendous amount of information. We're going to provide you all of your budget books at the end of the evening. Then we'll also have an opportunity when we have our individual budget workshops to ask more specific questions. This is just to give you an overview. You will have a copy of this PowerPoint in your budget books. Equity and support. We've talked about the full-time technology director. That's the position that we need to have. That's a cost of about $107,000. We were able to pay for that position by some savings. So by the time I'm going to say this the appropriate way. By the time we pulled our 2 employees back and took away that revenue that we were receiving from RSU60, and we looked at the expenditure that we were having to spend for the additional personnel to pay Noble, we came out about $45,000 ahead in that trade-off. So we were able to take that along with some mileage. We've paid about $5,000 a year for mileage, driving back and forth between districts. Some TTL positions that were not being filled at the elementary schools, in the high school, and then some purchasing of some different supplies. So we were able to pay for that through cuts that we made in the budget, because it's something that this is really for us. We have to have this next step. We want to continue our district diversity, equity, inclusion work with our consultant. Jermaine's done a great job for us. We're doing some great work right now. He is getting ready to present us with his recommendations around how to look at the strategic plan with a little bit of a different lens. And so we're waiting on that. We should hear within the next few days about that. And all that work together costs us about $19,000 total. So we have a .8 position at Marshall Great Works School. We really feel like as we bring these students back, the interventionist is going to be critical. So we want to move that position from a .8 to a full-time position. And that costs us about $22,000, and that's including benefits and everything else. It's a small thing, but it creates big problems. So one of the issues that we've had over the years is the registration process for our new students, and also for our kindergartners and pre-Kers as they come to school for the first time. We really feel like we need to improve our public-facing registration process. So we need to use technology, and we've got to create a contact person within the district that handles all of the registrations to start off with. One of the things that becomes very obvious is that we've tried to maximize what people do, and so one of the areas that we've done this is that we have a special education administrative assistant who does a tremendous amount of work in that area, but she's also our district data coordinator. So she wears 2 different hats. Does a fantastic job, but she spends more time untangling knots from failed data input around the registration process and around the Rollingsford management of who do we bill for. That created so much work for her that we felt like that we needed to denote one person. So we have a part-time employee in the central office that we would just like to add another 20% to be able to have a full-time person that she would be able to work directly with every day. It would solve a lot of problems. It help us with our Rollingsford billing, and it just creates a better experience for our families as they kind of integrate to the district. That's about $12,000 cost for that. How do we pay for this stuff? And so one of the things that we really looked at was special education restructuring, and we thought we could save about $108,000. And so part of that is looking at, so we felt like we could take some money out of our out-of-district placements, kind of projecting where kids are right now. So there's some savings there. We were looking at a school psychologist. We do that as a contracted service and spend an exorbitant amount of money on that. And we found that if we were to hire our own, we not only get additional subsidy from the state of Maine, because that's a position that they support but we don't access, that we could be able to save some money for the district, at the same time have a better level of service. And then our behavioral consultant is a contracted service. So we felt like if we hired our own BCBA within the district, again, we would save some money doing that. And so we kind of come out of that with about $109,000 increase without really impacting or even actually improving our services for our students. And I talked a little bit about the technology restructuring. And so part of that, that $123,000 is the savings from, not paying for the director and the installation person at Noble. Obviously, we would have to hire some other positions, but there's some savings there, as I talked about earlier. Safety. The additional school resource officer at Marshall Middle School. Don't get too accustomed to that. The $5,000 number looks great right now. Obviously, we know that that's a 3-year, buy-in with that. So that we would split the cost, but it would be $5,000 approximately the first year. Alice training, and so before the pandemic hit, remember we had talked about doing some district-wide work around school safety, school violence events, and so that there's no additional cost. We've already paid for that, but that's something that we will continue next year. I shouldn't say continue, that we will dive into next year. Roof repair at Elliott Elementary School, and so as we kind of looked at our district projects, Elliott's steepled roof needs to be repaired. So there's a cost of about $35,000 for that. We talked about this in paving at Marshall High School. I've never been so happy to see a number in my life, and I know it's going to sound crazy, but to get everything done was $160,000. And so I was expecting almost $500,000, but the good news is this, is that if we do it now, we're going to just be able to put a coat on top of it that will buy us more time rather than reclaiming all the asphalt. And that is a huge savings for us. And so that we felt like that would be an important step. And I can kind of go into that a little bit more detail as we get to the facilities work. One of the things that has kind of come up over the last year, as you can imagine, is that right now, Elliott Elementary School has 2.5 budgeted custodians. Obviously, with the elevated cleaning protocols, that's put a lot of stress, and there's been a lot of overtime placed on the people that are there. And so we felt really strongly that we wanted to increase that position to a full-time, and that costs about $38,000. New lease payments, HVAC. We had done the work at the Great Works School in the middle school. We also bought some new equipment, which is a tractor and a groomer, which is about $56,000. In order to pay for the superintendent's improvements, this is what we did. The paving and windows at Central School last year, we budgeted about $160,000, so that money is just going to get reallocated in the budget. The paving at Elliott Elementary School last year was $45,000, and so we're just going to reallocate that money. So really, you can see the $160,000 of paving and windows at Central is going to pay for the high school. The paving at Elliott now would probably go to the roof. And reduce in the facilities and equipment maintenance, we were able to buy a tremendous amount of equipment for cleaning, so we felt like we would be in really good shape, using the federal funds, and so we were able to reduce the maintenance costs because we had bought a tremendous amount of new equipment. So the thought process is they would be covered under warranty, so we were able to take a savings there. Character, responsive classroom training, and so one of the things that I know I don't think about, and my friends at the elementary school remind me so nicely, is that there's a possibility that next year we have pre-Kers, kindergartners, and first graders, and maybe even some second graders who have never been into a school building. And that just blows your mind when you think about that, because it's usually one grade that you bring in, and that's the case. And so we really feel like we need a district spruce up on our responsive classroom training. And so that's something that we're going to look to provide as we go forward. We're going to continue with our mental health first aid, that we're working with our guidance staff. We also want to work with our teaching staff to apply those skills to the classroom. Obviously, the mental health concerns are high without the pandemic, and obviously the pandemic has just amplified those. And again, we want to continue to work on our trauma-informed practices. We will want to continue our relationship with Sweetser, targeted at staff and students for their mental wellness, and so that's an important part of some work that we're doing. We want to keep supporting as people kind of move back, hopefully to some normalcy in the fall. Resources and fiscal responsibility. Here's the juggling match, right? We have a dual responsibility for the citizens of South Burke and Elliott to provide high-quality education to the residents of the district while maintaining some fiscal responsibility. And those are tricky, particularly in the midst of the pandemic. Sources of funds. So what did we look at in the budget currently of where we could save some money? So one of the areas that we looked at was some funding that the board put aside for We the People in Odyssey of the Mind. We are still going to have some seed money available, but it's just not going to be the amount that it's been in the past. I just think that's, in my opinion, I think those programs are wonderful, but at the same time, when it comes to necessities, we've got to be really mindful of what we're doing. And so we're cutting about $21,000 out of that. There would still be, I think, roughly $10,000 between the two things that if people needed some seed money to start, the district certainly wants to support that. But that's kind of an above and beyond opportunity, so there would be some savings there. Right now, we only have one student from the high school, and maybe that's changed, but when I checked a couple weeks ago, it was one student. So we felt like we could take some savings in the Dover vocational funding. So we put about $50,000 aside, so we took about $20,000 here just to be, I think we felt comfortable with that. Our diesel fuel usage is down, and so we felt like we could take a $10,000 cut in that. And again, this is one of those dangerous things, because you notice it says usage and not the negotiated agreement for the new price per gallon. So like when we locked in a diesel price, say we lock it in at $2 a gallon, which is great, but if you take that savings and then the next year is $3 a gallon, you've now created a cliff for the budget, and you've got to be very mindful of that. So we really looked at usage, and so we believe that the usage is down, and so that's why we took a savings there of about $10,000. Reduction in athletics, and so one of the things that we're seeing is that as the district shrinks, some of the opportunities that we've accessed in the past may not be as relevant. So for example, speaking with Mr. Buzzle, when we talk about first teams, there's not going to be the number of schools playing with first teams that had been 10 years ago. It's just there's no one to play anymore. A lot of schools are shrinking similar to what we are, and those are some of the programs where schools don't have the numbers to support. Our first teams, there's been a percentage every year that don't run because we don't have enough interest. And so what we're going to do is, rather than cut programs, because I think no one wants to do that, what we are going to say is, like, look, can we reduce the number of games that we're offering? So rather than play 16 games, maybe 12 games is what we can play at the middle school and the JV level. And there's some savings there. There's also some savings in some equipment. And there's also slight savings with uniforms as well.
You said JV. You said JV, but you meant first team.
First team, I'm sorry, first team, yes. Yep. Because JV is typically tied to the varsity. Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay.
Yep. But for instance, sometimes at the middle school, you might see a basketball season with 16 games.
Yeah.
16 games seems like a lot. Maybe if we play 14 or 12, there's a savings for each one of those things to do to still give kids the experience that they need. So there's a $12,500 reduction in a part-time mechanic. We are so fortunate that we found an outstanding mechanic. And so we had about $25,000 put in the budget for a full-time, we had a full-time mechanic and about $25,000 put in the budget for a part-time mechanic. So we felt like we could cut that in half. We still have the part-time mechanic that comes in when our mechanic needs a hand, but it's more of as needed basis. So we felt like we could take a savings there. Again, we didn't feel like there's going to be a $60,000 increase to our regular education tuition from Rollingsford. So remember, each student at Rollingsford has a dollar amount that they pay tuition to the district to attend. So we feel like we know that that's going to be increasing about $60,000. A special education student pays a tuition just like every student, and then there's a menu of services that they need. And because of that menu, there's also going to be about a $40,000 increase in our special education revenue that's coming in. Now, obviously, there's going to be some services that we have to provide, but there's going to be a $40,000 increase in revenue. And again, this is good news, bad news, is that we were able to purchase 4 buses this year, which is fantastic using the federal monies. But so we've had some bus releases that have expired, and we're not going to fill those, so we'll save $40,000 from the budget this year. 5 years from now, we're going to need to look at either changing our purchasing plan or putting money back into the budget. And I'm not trying to be a downer. I'm just trying to put all the facts out there so that everybody understands kind of the levers of how we approach this. And then there's another $21,000 approximately that we took, those changes in heating oil costs, staff mileage, and this is really us shaking the cushions out, trying to find any money that we can find. And I will tell you, it literally came down to, at one point, sitting down, trying to find $5,000. And that's not an exaggeration. In a $32 million budget, that was the level of detail that we tried to get into to be able to make this all work. So where are we for next year? Our projected enrollment is 2,154 students. That's down about 1%, and I want to be cautious of that number because we just don't know. We had, obviously every school in the state of Maine had an increase in the homeschool applications. We expect a percentage of those to come back, and we also don't know about the pre-K, K, and first graders that will be incoming next year because some families just chose to keep their kids home. So I feel comfortable where we are with staffing, but I just don't want people to read too much into that number because that really is a best guess at this point as we go forward. The total budget would be a $32,663,860 budget, which is a 1.08% increase from what the budget is currently. The projected tax increase for the towns of Elliott and South Berkeley is approximately 2.59%. Capital improvements. Paving at the high school, and so one of the things that we need to do in the upper parking lot is we're going to put a coat on top of everything at the upper level. We're also going to add an additional driveway around the back of the school for adult education. Right now, if you've ever been there, it's kind of a tough road, so we're adding that. And then in the lower parking lot, they didn't feel like we should be putting down new pavement at the lower parking lot at this time. Felt like if we repaired the cracks and still coated the athletic stadium large enough way in the lower parking lot, we would be good for another 6 years or so. Again, good news, we purchased 4 buses this year. We were able to pull that out of the budget, so that saves us some money out of our bus leases. Roof repair at Elliott Elementary School against a $35,000 cost. Future considerations for the board. And this is kind of the big picture stuff. First, if as we go through this process, if insurance comes in less and there's things we need to think about, I do have concerns about the supply money for the elementary schools in particular. I'm not as concerned about the high school, but certainly the elementary schools I'm concerned about with the cost of new math programs and things like that. That would be some area that I would recommend that we investigate putting more money in if more money became available. Big ideas here. If additional money is available, the board should consider investing to reduce or eliminate the $500,000 carryover funds. And so every year we take that $500,000 and carry it forward. And so when you do that, when I think about it, when we carry over money from one year to the next, that should be because we have a surplus and we're trying to get from a bad year to another year so we're not creating an undue burden on the district. So we want to build a bridge between a couple of years, maybe a year or a couple of years. That's the idea. The way we've created this now is you've created a super highway where now you're even in the budget I just gave you, you have to prepare for a $500,000 being left over, because if you don't, imagine just taking, so say something happened, and that's our contingency, we had to spend that for a crisis. We would be starting next year's budget conversation $500,000 in the hole before we even talked about a single raise, a increase in health insurance, or anything. And so if we can start to slowly wean ourselves off that $500,000, in the long term, the fiscal healthiness of that is going to be much better. And I think this is critical. And this isn't necessarily tied directly to the budget. It's more the end-of-year funds. But if there is money available at the end of the year, we should consider creating a maintenance for capital fund and a special education reserve account. And so we want to be able to start putting money away from year to year for these big capital projects that kind of come up. So we can avoid creating a lease to be able to buy a new boiler or those types of things where we can pay for it over time, putting some money away. The special education reserve account would be if there was an unexpected special education cost that kind of came up. So if, say, a family moved into the district and they needed a $90,000 placement and we didn't budget for that, we would have some money put aside every year to be able to start to slowly build that money up to be able to handle crises as they go. What I would like to avoid is walking a tightrope. I like to be able to, this is what we need to budget for. This is, we need to put money away in these areas. to be able to build some consistency. What are we most proud of? This has been a tough year. It's been on all of us in a lot of ways. And so we need to celebrate at the beginning of the year. When I did my, welcome to the 2020, 2021 school year, we talked about three things. Our goals are we have to navigate this pandemic. Like that's first and foremost. We've got to make sure our staff and students are emotionally well and safe. And we've got to grow in the area of district equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think we've done that. And we need to continue to use the strategic plan for our decision making. Like that needs to be a living document of who we are. Because when situations get tough, we have to be able to go back to something and say, this is what we believe in. I think open, honest, and transparent communication and problem solving was used throughout the entire budget process and the entire year. I mean, like, let's put the cards on the table, let's find a solution. Not everybody's going to be happy, but we're going to do the best that we can in the effort to provide the best education for students. Collaborative decision making. I go back to last summer, a lot of districts didn't include staff the way that we did. And I think having that collaborative process, we include staff, we included the parent surveys, we included the board. I think that decision making is really important. A budget that balances programmatic improvement and fiscal responsibility is critical. This year's budget has an overall increase of 0.108%. So a 2-year increase from last year's budget and this year's budget is less than 2.2%, and the overall CPI over that same time period is 3.7. That to me tells you how conscious and how much we value that responsibility that our communities gives us to make sure that we provide education at a reasonable fiscal price, and that's what we're trying to do. And then we hope to return to normalcy next year following the pandemic, and students are going to return affected, and how they're affected is going to be very, very different. We have students who are in school 5 days a week. We have students that are in school in the hybrid model. We have some schools, people who are homeschooled. We have some people that are remote. I mean, we have all these kids all of a sudden coming back, and they may not all be in the same spot, so we need to have the flexibility to meet kids where they are, and that's a really big idea, meeting kids where they are. This is my doom and gloom slide, so forgive me. Here's the balancing act. I've said it, and I just need to keep saying it, is that as we go forward, I just need to be clear that we're in the middle of a pandemic, so we made some really tough decisions when we created this budget. But going forward, that 2.5% increase every year is not sustainable for us. And what we can't get into is the situation where we're cutting staff to make payroll, because that starts to come out of programmatic value. We did it this year, and I'm proud of the work that we did, but I want to send a note of caution. That's why those reserve accounts are important. That's why making sure that we're not anticipating carrying forward $500,000 a year. That's money that we can use. We've got to create a plan that's sustainable over time, and it's going to take some time to build that. But I want to be clear that that's tricky. And again, simple math. If you take the 10% health care increase, which I showed you a slide was $450,000, that's what the cost of it. That's real money. That 2.5% for the communities, that's about a $500,000 amount of revenue that comes in. So that alone leaves you with $50,000 before you do a thing. And we haven't had a 10 in 7 or 8 years, but we had an 11.5 once, and so we just need to be mindful of that. So I'm happy with the work that we did, but I just need to make sure you understand. So here's the numbers. Here's the ultimate numbers. This is where we are this year. State subsidy is about $6,600,000. State subsidy for special education is $4.5 million. The Elliott contribution is about $10,150,000. The South Borough contribution is basically $8.2 million. Other revenues, which is our revenue that we come in from Rollinsford, we might come in from Elliott Kids Play might rent buses over the summertime to go on field trips. So that type of revenue that comes in, facility use monies, that was another $2.2 million. And then the utilization of the end of the year surplus. So you see that's that $500,000 number that we talked about, and that's what got us to that $32,315,000 budget that we're at now. Next year, on the budget we're proposing this evening, is a $6.7 million from the state, which is a slight increase. The state subsidy for special education is a decrease, as you can see. The Elliott contribution would go up about $300,000. South Berwick contribution would go up about $170,000. Other revenues, we calculated that to be about $26,000 of increased revenues. And then, again, the $500,000 carryover. So basically, this year's budget is about roughly $350,000 increase over where it was a year ago, which is that 1.8%. Any questions? I know it's an awful lot of information. We'll then go have our budget workshops, where we'll go through each cost center's monies. You'll get a copy of your budget book this evening when you leave, which will give you an overall view, and then a more detailed view by building. And then that will be also an opportunity to create some different considerations. And then obviously, that first meeting in May is when you present your budget to the community as to what you feel.
And our first workshop is in 2 weeks.
That's correct. Yes. Yes. Any questions from anybody? I know I just talked an awful lot of information.
Excellent. So helpful. Super helpful. As always.
Good. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank